Hey, g'day everyone. Welcome along to today's webinar. I'm John James and I'm still passionate about enabling change and innovation. That's why I'm hosting today's webinar, where we can explore and discuss issues relating to enabling change and innovation. The technology we're using today is really fun and easy to use. Here is an image of the GoToWebinar floating control panel. It's fully expanded when you first see it, but the clever little thing hides itself after just a couple of minutes so that you can better concentrate on the presentation. So hey, it's just like that pufferfish in Finding Nemo. Now, what's its name again? Quick, if you can remember its name, type it in the little panel at the bottom for me. Anyway, like the porcupine pufferfish it likes to hide. But if you poke at this little orange arrow here, it'll expand out again so that you can see all the panels. So let's see, has anyone been able to tell me the correct answer? No, not yet. So in actual fact, the answer is bloat. So do you remember he nervously swam in the fish tank of Philip Sherman's dental practice in Sydney? Quite pertinent today. So let's talk about the audio options. To listen to today's webinar, you can either use a computer headset or a telephone. We've had a few issues with the computer audio in the past. So today we've got a guy from Citrix joining us to make sure that the audio behaves itself. So if there's a problem at all, can you start to let us know by just typing a quick message and sending it to us in the bottom Q&A panel, and that way we can get onto it. And hey, if it does become too annoying for you, you can swap over and use the telephone at any time. Each country has its own dial-in telephone number, and naturally you'll need to pay the call costs involved. And if you do need to swap over, just go back to the audio panel that'll be on the side screen there for you, and you then just have to click on the micro. So you were on mic and speakers, you then click on the telephone, and then you just dial in. And make sure that you enter the details on your audio panel, not the numbers on mine, because we each have personalized codes. So folks, you can interact with us today by raising your electronic hand, which is just at the bottom of the skinny panel there. And you can also type your questions in the box down the bottom here. Now, only the organisers get to see your hand or what you type. So if you do ask a question, I'll just read it out so it's nice and anonymous. So hey, let's practice. If you can hear me clearly, can you click on the little hand to indicate that for me? Oh yes, I see the hands being raised everywhere there, so that's great. Fantastic, okay. And if you click on the little hand sign again, it'll lower your hand. So if you could do that, that'd be great. Okay, so there's been quite a lot of interest in today's webinar with a couple of hundred people registering. Now, when you registered, I invited you to indicate your location, and here is a Wordle to illustrate the level of interest that we've had from around the world. So naturally, Brisbane being the capital city of Queensland, where I live, there's lots of people. Toowoomba, the actual town that I'm in. But look, there's people from Orange, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Darwin, Bendigo, Perth, even Longreach. And I know that there's a couple from overseas as well there too. So folks, it's really good to have you all there. But now, to see who's actually with us live, I'm going to launch a quick poll to ask where you're normally located. So here's a map of Australia. So if you're from, and so a quick tour of Australia for our international guest today. So we've got South Australia down the bottom, and then as we come around, we've got Tassie, a nice island at the bottom there, Victoria, ACT, and New South Wales. So they'll all be clicking the first one in a moment. And then we've got Queensland, Northern Territory, and Western Australia. And we've got some people registered from New Zealand, and we've got some Canadians and other folks. So let me launch that poll there now. So if you can quickly just indicate where you're from. Okay, and I'll just close that off in a couple of seconds. 3, 2, 1. So I close that, and I'll share the results with you. So here we go. So you can now see that there's about 2/3 of the people from South Australia and round to New South Wales. About half are from Queensland, which is great. We've got a couple from New Zealand, from Canada, and 3% others. So hey, if you're the others, can you indicate where you're from, please? And we've got a special group today coming to us from the Northern Territory, a little place called Catherine, and we'll get to hear from one of those people later today. So if I get over to the next slide, okay, so folks, to get the most out of today's presentation, I suggest you turn off your email and tune into what our presenter is saying, take notes as we go along, and jot down questions as they come to mind and type them into the question panel. Now, just before we do start, I actually have one more poll that I will do. So I'll just launch that now. Actually, there we go. So here's a poll. So the question is, have you read the report using online tools to engage? So let me just quickly launch that now, and you'll be able to see the responses there. So several people have commented in previous webinars in the evaluations that they would have liked to have read some background material before the actual webinar. So this time I did send out the link so you could download Matt's recent report. So be honest now, who did actually read it? Okay, I'll just give you a couple more seconds. 3, 2, 1, and I'll close that, and I'll now share that with everyone so that this will help our presenter today. So a small number, 3%, yes, you have downloaded and read it, so congratulations. We should have bonus prizes for you. 17% are saying almost, they have it, but they've yet to finish it. 30% have said, sorry, I meant to, but the dog ate my homework, which here in Australia, Matt, is a common expression for, yeah, just didn't do it.
Yeah.
And half are saying, report, what report? So there we go. So let me just hide that now. Okay, so at this stage, I will make Matt a presenter. There we go. So in just a moment, we'll be hearing from today's guest presenter. The last 10 years have seen a dramatic increase in the use of online communication. Now there is a bewildering array of different online tools available. But how do you best use these online tools to help you engage citizens in public decision-making and problem-solving? Well, to answer this and more, we have with us today, all the way from Canada, where it's actually still yesterday at 9 o'clock at night, we have Matt Leighninger. Matt is the Executive Director of the Deliberative Democracy Consortium, an alliance of the major organisations and leading scholars working in the field of deliberation and public engagement. Now, Matt's recently written the report Using Online Tools to Engage and Be Engaged by the Public. It describes a range of scenarios and tactics and gives real-world examples of online engagement. Now, I have just earlier in the webinar popped the link in the little message panel there, so people can actually go and download that now if you wish. But of course, you'd be listening to Matt during the webinar. So I'm thinking, Matt, that this would be a good time to hand over to you. So Matt, welcome along. Thanks for joining us today. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, John. Can you see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Terrific. Thank you. Yeah, terrific. Thanks for organizing this. It's great to be talking with you. I'm actually going to be in Australia next month, so I'm excited to see perhaps some of you as well at the IAP2 Australasia conference in a few weeks. So the DDC, which is my main job in life, is an alliance of practitioner organizations and nonprofits, and you can see some of the logos of the practitioner groups there on the screen. The other half of the consortium are academic researchers all over the world, people like Lynn Carson and John Dryzak there in Australia, but many other people around the world who are studying public engagement and deliberative democracy, and the logos you see there are organizations who in various ways support it and champion it. It sounds very fancy to be introduced as the executive director of this august body. I have to also tell you, though, that I am the only staff, so I executively direct myself. So the slides that I'm going to be using here are, well, they should be available at slideshare.net. I was having a little trouble uploading them earlier today because the file is big, but if they're not up there already, they should be up there shortly. And the two guides that I'll be talking about mostly The one on the bottom is the one that John has already sent the link to, the one on using online tools to engage the public. The first one with the M1PVMP tag is another guide that might be helpful. It's called Planning for Stronger Local Democracy. So first, before we kind of get into the thick of this, we have another poll. John, do you want to do this one?
Of course I do. So let me just find the polls here. Yes, so here we go. I will now launch this.
So basically what this is asking is simply trying to get a sense of how experienced people are with face-to-face engagement or online engagement or both or not at all.
Okay, thanks. Most people have voted, so I'll close it off in 3, 2, 1. There we go. So it's great to see that about a third of our audience are quite experienced with face-to-face engagement. A small number are experienced with online engagement, as in only 4%, Matt, whereas 13% are quite experienced with both, and a whole lot have some experience mainly with face-to-face engagement, and yeah, 10% are just beginning. So a good cross-section there for you, Matt.
Great, excellent. So now you can still see my screen, is that right?
Yes, we can.
Great.
The big
Okay.
picture.
So good, the big picture here, and I think this is a big picture all over the world. You can tell me, of course, you are better judges of what is happening in Australia than I am, of course, but in general, my sense is that the internet has brought about a couple of enormous changes over the last 20 years all over the world, and the first one is one that I think is fairly set in. It's kind of empowering kind of individual citizens, the web, the email, some of the other kinds of initial kind of tools that the web brought to us all. And then the second shift is the fact that it is now in the process of empowering people in groups more through social media, through Facebook, through Twitter, through LinkedIn, all these different kinds of things. And so these are two enormous shifts wrapped up in other kinds of changes. It's not just about the internet, of course. We have rising levels of education. We have different attitudes toward authority, all kinds of things. But in general, we have kind of a different set of people these days. We have citizens who have different attitudes, that have different capacities, who want different things out of government and of the other kinds of public institutions in their lives, and they have less time to spare, but they have more of the kind of, they're better able to find the resources, the allies, the information they need to make an impact on an issue that they do care about. So in some ways, one way you could kind of talk about this is to say that citizens all over the world are better at governing and less willing to be governed than ever before. And of course, that is producing all kinds of other shifts, other kinds of trends that people who work for public institutions have to kind of react to. The second impact, I think, that the slow growth, or fairly quick growth actually, of these social media tools allow for new forms of engagement. Obviously, there's a double-edged sword here. You've got citizens who expect different things, who can do different things. That's provoking all kinds of challenges to the way that traditional institutions work. On the other hand, it produces all kinds of opportunities for you as a public official, as public servants, as other kinds of organizers and leaders in community, other ways for you to kind of reach out to people. And one of the cool things about this, I think, is that you can reach out to them in ways that are easier to sustain, easier to kind of keep that momentum going than some of the face-to-face kinds of engagement that we have been using in the past. I should have said at the beginning, I came into this work, 20 years ago, very much in the face-to-face side of things, and I worked for a long time for different organizations that were doing face-to-face forms of engagement. So I kind of know the strengths of that work and feel strongly about it. I also know some of the limitations. And I think some of the online tools and social media that we're talking about today offer some ways to make up for some of the limitations of the face-to-face work. And the fact is that the online and the face-to-face stuff complement one another well. In general, I think also that the second impact, the advent of social media kind of allows you to do recruitment a little bit easier. It allows you to kind of create a more interactive two-way conversation with kind of between the engagers and the engaged. And it's also something that kind of provokes you to kind of think more about infrastructure and about the kind of the whole picture of engagement, not just about what tool you're going to use in a certain situation. What's not changing with all of this stuff, I think, is first of all the need for face-to-face relationships. You know, face-to-face has different strengths. It has emotional impact. It has all kinds of different effects on the way people think about issues, the way they think about each other, that so far at least online communication can reproduce. On the other hand, online communication also kind of obviously adds some other kinds of strengths that face-to-face communication doesn't. It does not change also the need for an overall engagement plan. You need to have figured out for your agency, for your community, what is the overall picture here? What kinds of opportunities do we want to have available to people to engage in public life and in decision making? And of course, it doesn't change also the importance of partnering with other groups, other organizations, other institutions. This is not simply about government or other kinds of public institutions. It's about how they interact with one another and with citizens and with citizen groups. So before I hurtle on, any questions or comments? And John, you are unmuting people, or do I need to do that?
No, it's better that they type their messages down the bottom. So I've just had some problems in the past with computer feedback and that sort of thing when they use the audio. So folks, this is the opportunity to type some questions down in the Q&A panel there.
Mm-hmm.
So Matt, it looks all clear at the moment, so why don't you proceed?
I will keep going. Good. Okay. So here are what I think, just to kind of summarize here, the kind of successful recent public engagement tactics that have, that emerged over the last 10, 20 years. First of all, being proactive about recruitment, not just, calling meetings and expecting the right people show up, but thinking carefully about what kinds of people you want and how you're going to bring them to the table. Another successful tactic, of course, is bringing diverse perspectives together, not expecting people who are already on the same page of an issue to come, but to actually expect the people on different sides and to structure the experience so that they can actually learn from each other and decide together what they think. Giving people a chance to share their experiences, talk about why they care about an issue before they get into the more controversial kinds of questions. That, again, I think is a proven tactic all over the world. And then giving people a chance to make up their own minds, where you're actually laying out for them a number of different options and saying, here's A, B, and C. Which of these do you like? Is there a combination that you think works best? Is there a D that we have not thought of so far? But giving them a chance to kind of control the process and to make up their own minds about the issue. Another successful tactic is expecting and supporting action at a range of levels, from policy recommendations that you would like the public to produce to things that they might be able to do themselves as volunteers, as members of small action teams, as members of other organizations and groupings in the community. All those different kinds of things are valid and important and significant forms of action. And then finally, of course, and what we're going to be talking a lot about today, the increasing use of online tools to supplement and strengthen all of those other kinds of things. So to go through them quickly, one by one. I mean, with recruitment, and I know a lot of you have lived this, so you know what I'm talking about here. But the idea is to map community networks, find out what people belong to, so that you can reach into those networks and bring together a large and diverse critical mass of participants. I think that in general, this work has power when it produces those large critical masses of people. The more people you have, the greater diversity of those people, the more chance that this kind of work can actually lead to policy change and other kinds of impacts. So this work is, recruitment, as many of you know, it's probably 90% of engagement or participation work. Another successful tactic, and this applies both online as well as face-to-face, is the importance of small groups. So that if you want people to learn, if you want them to overcome divisions in the community, if you want them to deliberate, if you want them to plan for action, then all of those things are things that really can only happen in groups of no more than about 12. And so whatever your process is, whether it's face-to-face or online, if you have those kinds of expectations, you need to be figuring out how you can sort people, how you can divide people into small enough groups. Usually you need some type of facilitation in those kinds of processes. You need to have a facilitator who's impartial. meaning that simply that they're not there to give their own opinions. They're there to kind of be a servant to the process. Framing an issue, and I know a lot of people have done this as well, is essential to the deliberative nature of this kind of stuff. Giving people a chance to kind of look at a bunch of different options, laying that out in a kind of an agenda or a guide that starts out with some kind of personal experience kinds of discussion questions, then gets them into some of the kind of the meat of the issue, and usually ends with various kinds of questions or maybe a process for them to think about action and what they want to do. I like to kind of give people a couple of examples. One of the things that a lot of communities in the U.S. have done recently is to offer small kind of mini grants for these kinds of public engagement processes where people can actually get a small amount of money to help implement something that they've cooked up in one of their discussions. So this is an example. This is in Minneapolis. People in the neighborhood in Minneapolis got a couple $100s, I think, from the city government to do traffic calming. Basically, what they're doing here is painting a mural in this intersection, which shows, which actually serves to kind of slow down cars as they kind of move through the neighborhood. Then an even better example, I think, or a more fun example. This is a highway or underpass in Seattle. And in this particular neighborhood, people have been talking about the fact that this is a kind of a scary place to go to at night. There was kind of drug dealing happening in this particular highway underpass. It was kind of a problem for the neighborhood. And so here again, they were able to get a small grant from the city government to do something about this. They kind of tapped into the talent and energy of people in this neighborhood, and what they built was a troll, which. And if you see this Volkswagen Beetle here at the bottom right, that this is actually it's a real full-size husk of a VW Beetle. So it gives you a sense of the size of this troll. So this has now become a tourist attraction. People come from all kinds of other places to have their pictures taken in front of this troll. So from a kind of a scary spot in the neighborhood to a tourist attraction, it's come a long way. And of course, it's kind of emblematic of the fact that if you give people a chance to kind of expend their own creativity and energy in service of solving a public problem, then you're doing a great job of this kind of work. So online tools, as I said, not generally a replacement for face-to-face, but a terrific supplement. And what they're particularly good at so far are these 5 things. First of all, giving background information to people in a way that they can they can get the basics from you, but then also at a click of the mouse, of course, they can get far more information if they want it. It's particularly good for empowering people to actually be gatherers of data as well, that through GIS mapping and other types of kind of the technologies that are in our smartphones as well as our desktops, that you can kind of give people a chance to kind of give you information about where the potholes are, where the graffiti is, what the water quality is like in the stream near your house, all those different kinds of things. So people are able to kind of play a role in data gathering with this kind of technology that they have not been able to do in the past. Online tools are also very good as far as generating and ranking ideas, giving people a chance to kind of propose a whole bunch of ways of solving a particular problem. People can comment on each other's ideas, improve them, vote on them, rank them, all those kinds of things. One term for this is crowdsourcing, but in general, it's something that online tools are set up well to do. Helping people visualize options. That's another kind of key way in which online tools can enrich engagement. One way is by giving people a chance to look at budgets, by giving them an opportunity to, with a spreadsheet that's interactive, that they can kind of take money away from one part of the budget, give it to another, raise revenue, lower revenue, see the effects of all those different kinds of options on the bottom line for the city's budget or the agency's budget. And so help them visualize the kind of the implications of what they're saying that way. Another related kind of thing is through land use. So there's all kinds of online tools now that allow people to visualize what the implications are of various planning options. What happens if we put the grocery store here as opposed to there, or if we widened this street as opposed to that one. So all kinds of ways of giving people a chance to kind of look at what the possibilities might be. And then I think, again, the most exciting thing to me about some of these online tools is that they correspond to one of the greatest disadvantages of the way we have done face-to-face engagement in the past. That my experience, at least, with face-to-face engagement is that you do a whole lot of work with recruitment. You get this large and diverse critical mass of people to the table. That can have all kinds of various outcomes if you structure the process well. And yet, once you go back 6 weeks later, a year later to the community, things have not changed. And the momentum that you built up through that face-to-face process generally has been lost. The relationships have faded. The sense of trust and excitement has faded as well. I think there's a tremendous possibility with social media linked to face-to-face kinds of engagement that social media can maintain those kinds of connections and the civic momentum simply because what they do, what they're good at, is giving people a way of being involved in something that is totally convenient for them and yet interactive enough that they feel like they're part of something. They can do it at 11 o'clock in their pajamas, but it's also something where if they type in a comment or ask a question, other people will respond. Anytime you talk about online engagement, you have to talk about digital divides, or divides plural, actually. And that's, in fact, an important point, that the way in which we have talked about the digital divide, certainly in the US and Canada, is too simple, that we have talked about it as if it was simply a question of who had internet access and who doesn't. And if you think about the digital divide in that sense, then the numbers, are reassuring in the sense that, internet access to the internet is growing. The gaps are shrinking among all these different kinds of demographic groups. There's no longer much of an age gap or much of a gap in terms of race and ethnicity or even so much in socioeconomic class. So in that sense, the digital divide is shrinking. Now, on the other hand, in every country in the world, I'm sure that gap will never be zero. There will always be people who do not have access to the internet, which for me is one important reason why you need to have face-to-face in addition to online types of opportunities for engagement. On the other hand, one thing you need to kind of recognize, I think, with this work is the fact that access, whether that's to the internet or the government, is not enough in and of itself. Just because people have access to the internet does not mean they're actually going to be coming to your website or taking part in your online discussion about, the issue of the moment. You got to recognize, of course, that different people use different kinds of hardware, that some people are using smartphones, some people are using desktops, some people are using laptops. So that's one thing you have to understand. Another is, and more important thing, is that people go to different places and they use the internet for different things. So some people are basically just doing kind of traditional websites and email. Other people are doing Facebook. Others are doing Twitter. Others are doing other kinds of things. So you got to understand, I think, that communities and countries are just as complicated online as they are offline. And simply because you have a website up or that people have access to the internet doesn't mean that you're going to be able to get them to participate. That some of the same kind of practices and techniques that are evident in face-to-face kinds of engagement are equally applicable to the internet. You've still got to figure out where people are, where they're going, what networks they belong to, and be able to reach into those networks to be able to pull people in and attract people to what you're trying to do. Some common mistakes. So one thing that often organizations still do today is to treat the internet as a one-way medium, that it's basically a replacement for the newsletter that they used to do or the other kinds of kind of one-way vehicles that they used to use to just get their message out. And of course, it's more than that. I remember hearing somebody say in a meeting that embedded in the DNA of the internet are two values, transparency and democracy. And unless you kind of understand that those things are kind of built into this whole infrastructure here, you won't understand the basis of this or the potential of this to be not simply a one-way medium, but a two-way, and in fact, multi-way way for people and organizations and institutions to interact around public issues. Another common mistake is not enough recruitment, and this kind of goes to what I was saying before about digital divides. If you simply think that putting your website out there or sending out an email blast is enough, you're making the same mistake you might have made in the face-to-face world where you simply called the meeting and hoped that people showed up. You've got to figure out where people are and go out and get them. Some people are kind of really focused on transparency and the notion of kind of putting government data and other kinds of public data online without really doing enough work to kind of engage people in figuring out how to use and absorb and analyze that data. So there's some of that kind of work of transparency only, which is not really it's a fine thing, but doesn't really qualify as engagement. And then a final thing that you often see as a common mistake is, particularly with things like crowdsourcing, when you're asking for people to propose solutions to public problems, you've got to make it very clear what your capacities are for implementing those ideas. And you've got to put out that message that you're hoping and expecting people themselves and organizations, other people outside your institution are actually going to be able to help implement this. And you've got to be clear what you're going to be able to do in your institution to kind of how much money you have or how much capacity, how much staff time you have to implement ideas. So I have blundered on through here fairly quickly. By the way, this cartoon comes from the Chapel Hill News, which is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. It's a cute little cartoon that one of the students wrote about a public engagement effort that was happening in the town. Does anyone have questions or comments at this point?
Well, do they ever, Matt? So I've got a bunch of questions here, so I'll try to cluster them together for you. So let's see. So a number of people have commented that they love the examples, and particularly showing the art as an answer to problems. And I guess a question from earlier on, Matt, is what is deliberative democracy? Can you tell us that? Yeah.
Well, it depends who you ask. And the whole notion of terms in this work, as I'm sure a lot of you have experienced, is a little tricky because we have lots of different terms, and when people use them, it's not quite clear what they mean. And in fact, a lot of these things become synonyms for one another. Among practitioners, deliberative democracy and public engagement, public participation, and citizen involvement, about 5 other civic synonyms tend to be used interchangeably. Among academics, it's somewhat more distinct, usually, and I suppose in an academic frame of mind, basically what you're talking about with deliberative democracy is some kind of process where you're getting people to kind of address an issue in this kind of rational sort of way where they are learning a lot about the issue, where they are they're looking carefully at a number of different policy options on the table. They're trying to decide which one of them they think is best, and they're coming up with some kind of conclusion at the end. But again, it really, I'm not so sure once you get into the real world whether deliberative democracy helps you that much as a term, or whether it simply is another way, yet another way of saying, here's what works in productive public engagement.
Okay, thanks, Matt. A few people are tapping into the area that if this is the era of economic rationalism, what about the cost that's associated with the process? So the cost of online engagement and its return. What are your thoughts about that, Matt?
Well, I mean, I think generally there's a really good paper that I saw maybe 6 months ago. It's called Democracy Pays. It's from a guy in the UK. It's a very interesting argument that he rolls out. His name is Largescale, which I won't try to spell on the phone. But if you look up Democracy Pays, you probably will find it. But basically making the argument that that in this time of economic crisis, particularly for local governments, but really governments all over the world, that what they need to be doing is engagement. That basically, if you're not trying to engage the community somehow in figuring out what you're spending money on, how you're trying to solve public problems, if you're not doing that, you're essentially eating your seed corn, because which I'm not sure that translates as an Australian. That's maybe a U.S. agrarian example, but basically meaning that you're taking away your kind of fundamental assets. And in fact, to make it better, kind of give you a better vignette, I was in city, Charlotte, North Carolina, last year, making a presentation on why engagement is a good thing, and I was trotting out all my various slides. This was a presentation to county department heads. They were all nodding politely, but I could tell they weren't quite buying what I was saying. At the end, the city manager kind of got up and said, look, you people have to understand that if you think we're going to come out of this recession and things are going to go back to the way they were, you've got another thing coming. That essentially what we need to be doing in order to survive as an entity is to kind of reframe our relationship with our constituents, because they are the reason we are going to get money or not. And if we can't figure out that fundamental relationship by engaging them and figuring out what they want and how they want us to operate, then we're not going to be able to exist. And that was, as you might imagine, a far more persuasive little speech than anything that I had said in my slides. And I think so essentially, figuring out the kind of the long-term picture, and we'll get to this in a second. I think part of what's cost-effective about this is having a long-term plan, not simply kind of reacting to the latest situation or the latest crisis with a new kind of engagement tool. But that fundamentally, if you can't kind of establish that kind of better relationship with constituents through better engagement, then you're continually going to be in a situation where you're having to cut and cut and cut from public budgets.
Okay, so Matt, we've got lots of questions, so I'll just ask one more, and it's about the balance of where you're creating open blog spaces online and that sort of thing versus having a space hijacked by others. So how do you allow for the peer learning and not to allow for others to take it over with their own commercial promotion and that sort of thing? How do you balance that risk?
Well, it's hard to answer that without kind of more specifics as far as a context. I think generally one thing that's important is whatever you're doing, whether this is kind of your process that you are running, kind of that you are actually kind of operating the whole thing from your office, or something that perhaps maybe it's something you're partnering with other community organizations to create. Either way, I think one general principle is that with these kinds of processes, there can't be anonymity. That basically you've got to have something where people actually have to register and to say who they really are. And once they're kind of open about their identity, that tends to be kind of a police. It has its drawbacks as well. In fact, there's some interesting academic research on this. But in general, in terms of kind of creating a more productive discussion, that lack of anonymity tends to be important. Another piece is just as you would in a face-to-face sort of meeting, if you can group people into smaller groups and give them some time to actually talk to each other, get to know each other a little bit better, kind of structure the conversation that way through some kind of threaded discussion or something else that enables them to kind of group in various ways into groups of no more than about 12. When you do that, also, it kind of tends to make things more productive. It tends to reduce the possibility that any one person or group is going to be able to hijack the whole process. It tends to kind of force people to really listen to one another, or literally or figuratively, to understand one another better and to kind of figure out what they might want to do.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I'm conscious of time, so I'll let you go back to your presentation now.
Great, okay. We have a poll. So it's back to you.
We do. Here we go. Here's the poll. There's 4 options for you folks. So if you can quickly choose one. So does this presentation match your experiences with public engagement? Yes, no, maybe, not enough experience. I can see lots of people jumping in there. It's great, Matt. We've got 146 people on live with us at the moment.
Awesome.
And of course, they're all typing in questions madly. So folks, I know we won't cover all the questions today, but we'll do the best that we can. So thanks, everyone. I can see the bulk of people have now responded, so I'll now share that. So yes, okay, so we see a third is saying, yes, it does fit with my experience. Fortunately, no one is saying, no, it doesn't. Yep. And about another third is saying in some ways it does, in some ways it doesn't, and yeah, maybe I don't have enough experience.
I'm surprised. I think you should be challenging me a little more. Okay, good. All right, so let me give you a couple more specific kinds of examples. And these are from my neck of the woods, at least up in my continent. Here's a process that started in 2009. It was initiated by this group in Ontario called the Local Health Integration Network, and these LHINs, or LINs as they're called, are responsible for a lot of the health administration in Ontario. The group that worked with them on this is a group called Ascentum, which you can Google. It's at ascentum.ca, and does a whole lot of interesting face-to-face and online kinds of work. And the process here was to figure out how, in a very disparate, very geographically broad area, this is a part of this province which is far away from Toronto and the other big cities. It's way up where you've got a very small town spread over several hundred miles. And they were able to get 800 people involved in this process. The whole thing received an award from IAP2. part of what they did was they produced this kind of online choice book that provided people with some background information about the issue and some data, provide some of the main options. Then they had this that gave people kind of some sense of each other's experiences with healthcare in this part of the province. And then there was in addition to the online conversations, there was a conversation guide that people could download online that enabled them to do face-to-face small group meetings, and there was pieces for facilitators and moderators of these face-to-face meetings as well. Here's a process in Georgia, which is interesting in the sense that it kind of had two phases. One was a purely face-to-face phase, and it happened around 99 and 2000, and then they revisited the whole thing and did it again about 10 years later. Both times, the idea was to create a comprehensive plan for the community, not simply a land use plan, but a plan that kind of helps people decide what they want to do about school issues, issues of race and diversity, issues of growth, all different kinds of things that they were dealing with in the community. The number of participants was quite large, and particularly for a town of this size, about 17,000 people, to have 450 people in 2000, then 680 when they did it again, was a nice critical mass and diverse critical mass for this town. By the way, Decatur is essentially a suburb of Atlanta. The second time they did it, it was much more than just a face-to-face experience. It had all kinds of online ways for people to be involved in this. You could give testimonials online. You could see all kinds of background information. You could vote on various aspects of the plan. There are all kinds of ways that you could do things online in addition to what you were doing in the face-to-face world to be part of this whole process. And as you can see, the kind of the graphics here was very compelling, and the visuals were really helpful and exciting for people. Some of the outcomes here of this process, and this is kind of mostly from the first round. The second round, kind of some of the outcomes are still kind of forming. But essentially, both times what they did was create this kind of comprehensive plan for the community with a really broad kind of sense of public support behind what they were trying to do. It created a thing called the Decatur Neighborhood Alliance, which is an alliance of neighborhood organizations and other grassroots groups in the community. One of the things people were talking about was the problem of gentrification and the fact that senior citizens in particular were having trouble remaining in their homes. And so one thing that came out of this was a tax abatement plan for seniors. And then also the development decisions were particularly controversial around gentrification and all kinds of other things. And so one thing that happened as a result of this was to create a new zoning process by which developers would meet with large numbers of people in small groups in neighborhoods to figure out what their plan was, how what input people might have, how they could come up with something that developers would like, and also that the neighborhood would support. So let me say, and I've given you a lot of the kind of the strengths, I think, of kind of these temporary kinds of issue-based or decision-based forms of engagement, and I think those strengths are important. That these kinds of processes all over the world have shown that you can make policy decisions in a more rational, more broadly supported kind of way. You can catalyze citizen action in various ways. You can build trust between citizens and government and between different groups of citizens. You can foster new leaders as they kind of, through these processes, kind of find their voices and make connections and begin to kind of take on bigger roles in their communities. So all those strengths of this work are very real. On the other hand, of course, the limitations are also real. And one of the biggest limitations is that, as a lot of you, I'm sure, have experienced, this kind of work is incredibly time-consuming. The recruitment in particular is very time-consuming to kind of build those networks, to build those relationships, to be able to bring people to the table. This is particularly problematic when you consider that these things are not sustainable. In fact, they're not meant to be sustained. That in general, we tend to do engagement as kind of a one-off sort of thing, that we're trying to get people involved in the particular issue or crisis of the moment, and what we're doing and what we're setting it up is not really even intended to be sustained after that issue is dealt with or the problem has been solved or not solved. In general, I think engagement, the way we have done it, tends to meet the goals of the engagers, not necessarily the engaged. That even when we bend over backwards to make sure that people's views are represented in discussion materials or in other kinds of ways, that we're not necessarily kind of giving the same control of the agenda to them. I think in general, as I said before, that if you go back to a community which has had a wildly successful engagement process, that often you will find that even though the process itself had all kinds of wonderful outcomes, it did not have a substantive effect on the way that the institutions operate. It didn't really change the way that citizens and government in that community interact. It didn't necessarily have a large-scale impact on equity, which is, I think, stands to reason. I mean, issues, inequities are quite entrenched in our communities, and it's probably unrealistic to expect that any kind of short-term engagement effort is actually going to shift them. And so what we have been doing is to be doing kind of short-term kinds of processes. What we really need to be thinking about now is to think about kind of longer-term visions and plans for how engagement is going to work in a community. So having given you that passionate argument, we have another kind of opportunity for questions or comments.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Matt. So we've got a bunch of questions, and a few comments as well. So the comments being made that they work in a state government and they have an online forum, and they're saying that there's no one interested in putting their name next to any posts right now. So there's very low engagement and trust from employees with state government management right now. Do you find that as a common problem, Matt?
Yes. We need to know more about this. Well, I'd like to know more about this particular situation, but in general, yes, if there's not a kind of a hot issue on the table, if not, a lot of recruitment has not been done, then yes, I would expect that numbers, that engagement would generally be low, especially given that state and provincial levels of things, people are generally less, it's not that they're less interested in them, it's just that they're even less convinced that they can actually make an impact. And that's, I think, the biggest question that you always have is, it's not apathy. It's that people need to feel like whatever they're going to do is actually going to make some kind of difference. And so that's a more difficult argument to make when you're working at the state level than at the community level.
Okay. Now, a question here. So can you give us a feel for the changing attitudes of corporations and government agencies to stakeholder engagement that you've seen, I guess, with the different countries that you've dealt with over the last couple of years, Matt?
Well, I think at least one difference that comes to mind is it seems to me that in Canada, where I live, and in Western Europe, there's more of a sense that government is the problem solver. That is its role, and that what goes along with that is there's more of an expectation within government and outside government that part of the role of public employees and public officials is to consult. So the word consultation is quite common in Canada, fairly common, I think, also in its various translations in Western Europe. In the U.S., that is not there. And I think from what I can tell in places like Brazil and India and other kinds of developing countries in the world, that sense that government is the only problem solver and that government's role, part of government's role is to consult, that is not there. What is there on the positive side is a fairly strong tradition of people, organizations, faith institutions, businesses actually kind of rolling up their sleeves and helping to take part in public problem solving. So I think somewhere in there's a happy medium, and I'm not sure where Australia fits in this spectrum that I'm talking about, but clearly having governments who feel that consultation and kind of engagement with citizens is something they ought to do, clearly in my mind that's a positive thing, and yet also it is a positive thing to have an environment where all kinds of people feel like they are also problem solvers themselves, that they and their organizations have some kind of role to play, that it's not all up to government and what kinds of recommendations we can give to the public sector.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Matt. I'm conscious of time, so we'll need to wrap it up in a few minutes' time. So I know you've got one more section to go.
Sure. Okay. Great. So we wanted to talk a little bit about, and this is using that guide that at least a few of you downloaded, so I'm just going to kind of point to a couple of these pages here, and you can see a whole lot more when you click the link that John gave you, and it will all appear for you. But essentially, one of the things that the guide does is it tries to map out some different scenarios of situations where you might use online tools and try to explain which kinds might be good for which purposes. So this is one of the scenarios, and that, it's basically kind of arguing that when you are in the midst of some kind of situation in which different sets of people don't agree about what should be done, that really that's something where only large-scale kinds of deliberation, where people are actually interacting with each other and picking from different options, that's the only kind of thing that's probably going to be helpful. And it's an area where it's particularly important that face-to-face meetings be part of the process. Another scenario is one where you're kind of needing good ideas and more information from citizens, and in those kinds of situations, it may be that the kind of the crowdsourcing kinds of things and other kinds of the visualization kinds of tools online will be enough, perhaps, to solve the challenges that you've got. If you are trying to encourage people to take shared ownership of something, and this is, again, a situation where you can be doing this in concert with other kinds of face-to-face and online deliberation, but basically where you're giving people a chance to to do something about some of these issues, you might use wikis. You could use some of the tools that provide people with shared workspace, like Civic Evolution, other kinds of things like that, that allow people to kind of not only talk about and make recommendations about an issue, but really work together hand in hand to do something about it. But in general, as I said before, I think that part of what you need to be doing, if I were you, is to think about more sustainable kinds of engagement in order to sustain the benefits of the short-term kinds of engagement, to allow people more chance to set the agenda, to better address inequities, to increase community attachment, which in fact has been shown to have a kind of a correlation with economic growth and vitality, and to really, just because people enjoy this kind of stuff, give them a greater sense of their own legitimacy and public happiness. And so I know a lot of you probably are experienced with the IAP2 spectrum, and this is an attempt to try to kind of modify that for use not only around a particular public decision, but to try to describe the kinds of things you might want to see happening in your community, in your state, over the long term, and to kind of try to think about what kinds of activities might be happening all the time that might support these various different aspects of kind of more robust public life. This chart, by the way, comes from the other guide that I gave you a link for at the beginning of the slides. It's the one called Planning for Stronger Local Democracy, and it is a publication of the National League of Cities. One assumption I should say, I should be clear about this, and I think about this type of planning in particular, is that it simply cannot be government's job alone. That the burden for supporting and planning kind of this more long-term kind of sense of public engagement, public participation, that's something that government should be doing in concert with school systems, foundations, libraries and universities, all kinds of businesses, all kinds of other entities in the community. And so part of what needs to happen, I think, is a stronger kind of process by which people who are trying to do engaging get together and decide what are the kinds of needs we have as engagers, what kinds of needs do we see in the community for the engaged, and how can we work together to kind of, through a kind of range of online and face-to-face ways, kind of create this kind of more healthy, robust civic engagement picture for everybody. So here, again, from the same guide that I've been talking about, Planning for Stronger Local Democracy, here are some kinds of building blocks you might consider as part of that kind of process. What kinds of spaces do you have available for citizens in neighborhoods and schools? What kinds of online spaces do you have? What kinds of skills and capacity do you need? What kinds of ways can local government and other decision makers kind of change the way they operate so that people have better ways to participate in those kinds of decision making and problem solving efforts? So I'm on to some kind of concluding here with some resources to look out for. This one's called Participedia, and you can find it at participedia.net. It's already the largest resource out there in the world, and it's online for participation efforts, and it's got examples from all over the world. You can look at a bunch of different examples that are already written up, and you can also submit your own. URL here on this list is my own website, deliber-democracy.net. So the community is an opportunity to kind of find out more about the link between engagement and economic growth and vitality. I've listed 3 more American organizations that you may not have heard of who do very good practitioner-based kind of work, lots of how-to materials, discussion guides on various issues. If you want to kind of get updates from me about some of this public engagement work, you can go to find me on Facebook. It's facebook.com/deliberative.democracy, and you'll get updates that way. The last thing, the title there is my book. And then these are the two kind of guides here that I've been talking about most in this presentation. So, sorry, I'll put that one back up in case people want to write down the URLs. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, so we do have a bunch of questions. So I'll just tick off the top two for me. So here we go. So how can you demonstrate to people their online input is valued and being listened to and acted upon?
Good question. Well, and I think one of the trickiest things about this is that people generally underestimate their own ability to remain in the loop. So if you ask them, how do you want us to follow up with you to let you know the results of this process or something like that? And they will often say, oh, well, just make sure there's an email about it, or it's on the website, or it's an article about it in the newspaper, or something like that. And in fact, those don't work. People don't recognize the fact that they are continually bombarded, as we all are, by all kinds of information every day. And so you can't believe them when they say those kinds of things. And I think, actually, for me, this is yet another reason why you need to be thinking about kind of longer-term types of engagement, because it's only when people remain engaged and remain talking to one another or getting emails or commenting on things over the long haul, that's really the only way in which you really are able to kind of keep them in the loop as far as the information that you're giving. So the answer to kind of informing people about what happened from some type of engagement process they took part in is to keep them engaged in some way through social media or some other way, so that they are actually going to be able to find out about it.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Matt. We're going to have to cut it off there. But folks, this is an opportunity to talk about the blog for enabling change and innovation. So there's been a bunch of really good questions. So I'd encourage you, I'll put up a new post, which will have a recording of today's webinar plus Matt's presentation slides. And you'll be able to ask questions there. And I'll tee up with Matt that he can see them and he'll be able to respond to your questions there.
Yeah.
So, okay, thank you. So I'll send that email out depending how I go with technology today and converting the recording to YouTube and all that sort of thing. Now, folks, a useful feature of the Enabling Change blog is that there's this here, Suggest a Webinar, which enables you to use our user voice system to suggest what you'd like to hear about in future. And so that's why we had Matt along today, because someone had asked about online engagement. So, folks, as of this morning, the one with the highest vote is, who gives a twit about Twitter? So what's it all about? Should I be bothering tweeting? And do I need to do anything to protect myself online? So, folks, if that sounds interesting to you, you're welcome to come along in about 6 weeks' time. So on Tuesday, the 30th of October at 12 noon. Now, of course, we'll have daylight saving, or, well, we won't have daylight saving, but many other places will. So that's 12 noon Queensland time. And Cynthia Marnie is a keen member of APEN, and she's agreed to do a webinar on that for us. Folks, today's webinar has been brought to you by our proud sponsors of the Queensland Government, for whom I still have the pleasure of working, APEN, our professional organisation for extension, and also Citrix GoToWebinar. So I'll just unmute Austin. So here's the president of APEN. Austin, how are you? Are you there, Austin? Nope. Well, that didn't work. So I'll just go to plan B, because Austin did give me some notes. So he's running a meeting up in Catherine, and I know that they had some audio issues for him to actually speak while listening to all of us there. So Austin's the president of APEN. He's based in Catherine in the Northern Territory, and he's got several colleagues there with him at the moment. So he'd like to just draw to your attention that APEN is working with people to bring about change in industries, communities, and the way we manage our natural resources. And if I can only get the slide to move, here we go. So APEN runs webinars just like this one. They run local events. They have major forums and conferences, and the next big one is the international conference next year in New Zealand. So look out for that one. They also do an Extension Net newsletter. That's a bit of a tongue twister. And of course, they represent the profession, so they do much more as well. So the key 3 things that APEN does is networking, where you too can connect with up to 500 members across Australia and beyond. Professional development, where you can attend seminars and conferences and webinars like today, and also the representation. So here are the contact details, and you will also get more information as part of the survey afterwards. Now folks, the other great sponsor we have with us is Citrix, and they are providing the software that powers today's webinar, and they're offering a free trial of their product and a discounted subscription. So all you need to do is tick the appropriate boxes in the follow-up survey that you'll get in the next day or so. Now folks, I'd like to hear what you think of the webinar, so don't be a monkey. When you receive our survey invitation, make sure you fill it out because that provides me with useful information and supports our sponsors. And of course that's powered by none other than SurveyMonkey. So folks, thanks for attending today. It's been great having you along and all your interaction. Thanks for so many good questions and comments there. I'd like to thank Matt again for his presentation. You crammed a whole lot in there, and it's great that we've got your report and the different links that you've given us. So big thank you, Matt, for staying up late at night there. It's almost 10 o'clock there now. And thanks to all the attendees for coming along today and interacting with us. So folks, I look forward to seeing your comments and ideas over on the blog. So wishing you all the best until we meet again, Peru now. And thanks to you, Matt. See ya.
Thank you.